Hope you're doing well. I do just want to take a second to acknowledge a few things about the AP exam. So, as you have probably heard, the AP exam has been moved to Friday, May 15th at 2 o'clock. It will cover units 1 through 7, which is basically Columbus through World War II, through 1945. So we'll basically cover one more unit after this. We will watch a couple of review videos for what we will miss for the rest of the course, and then we're going to start practicing for the AP exam, which, as you know, is modified, and it's going to be 45 minutes long. It will be open notes and open book, and it will be a modified DBQ. So they're going to give you a rubric, a new rubric, and you can get 1 or 0 to 10 points on it. There will be 5 documents instead of 7, and the new rubric, which I will give more details on that shortly, will pretty much be the same as a regular DBQ rubric. They're just assigning more points for what you were already doing before. They haven't added like anything new to it. They've really just modified what we already have. I don't know for sure, we don't know for sure what constitutes passing. We just know that more information is coming. But I'm guessing if you get a 5 out of 10, that'll be a 3. If you get a 7 out of 10, that'll be a 4. If you get a 10 out of 10, it'll be a 5. I'm not sure. More to come on that. But we will, after we finish this unit, cover one more unit. We'll review. Or we'll not review, I'm sorry. We will cover what we've missed, what we will miss this year, kind of quickly, and then we'll start reviewing for that 45-minute DBQ. All right, so we are looking at the second New Deal today. This is going to be divided into 2 parts. So this is part 1 of the second New Deal. All right, so this begins in spring of 1935. The first New Deal obviously had some successes, but despite Roosevelt's best efforts, the Depression continued, and the New Deal would be helpful as well, but that ultimately would not bring the United States out of the Great Depression. All right, so starting in 1935, these second New Deal acts were passed. The first one is the Wagner Act, and this one ensured the right of employees to collective bargaining with their employers. So all this means is that employees could negotiate with their managers for better working conditions and wages. And it also made it so that employers could not interfere with union activities. So people who were involved in unions could continue to be a part of their union and could continue organizing and collective bargaining, and the employer could not stop them. Okay, the second New Deal measure was the Social Security Act, also passed in 1935, and this one set up a federal system of old age pensions and unemployment insurance, so that if you got fired, you could draw unemployment. And in fact, if you are working now and you're not paid under the table or you're not paid in cash, you can look at your paycheck and you can see where Social Security is taken out of your paycheck. And this started in 1935, but it's a government form of retirement. So they're taking money out of your check now, and once you're, I think, 65, you can draw from Social Security. You'll start getting a check. All right, the Rural Electric Administration, the REA, did exactly what it sounds like. It brought electricity to rural areas. It's kind of like the Tennessee Valley Authority, but this one was more expanded to other areas. The wealth tax, also passed in 1935. This one drastically raised taxes on large incomes, estates, and gifts. So like if let's say a wealthy man wanted to gift his son with $100,000 on his 21st birthday, that thing would be taxed like crazy. If you you can pull up from Google what the taxes were like during the second New Deal, and like the top wealthiest 1% were taxed like 90-something% of their income. So almost all of their income was being paid in taxes. All right, so shortly after the Second New Deal takes place, the election of 1936 happens, and you have President incumbent FDR running for the Democratic Party against Governor Alfred Landon of Kansas. And Landon had the support of the moderate wing of the Republican Party, but regardless, Roosevelt won decisively. He carried every single state except for Maine and Vermont. And so, on top of that, the Democrats won majorities in both the House and the Senate. And they also made large gains in city elections and other state elections. And this is also when you see blacks switching to the Democratic Party in large numbers. Also, elderly people were really thankful for the Social Security Act. So he had a lot of old people voting for him. And people who were members of labor unions also donated lots and lots of money to FDR's campaign. All right, so FDR and the Supreme Court. And so one of the great obstacles to Franklin Roosevelt was that he was very liberal. Think about how he was expanding executive authority. But several conservatives were on the Supreme Court, and so they were the ones blocking most of the New Deal measures and declaring them unconstitutional. And so FDR does something that is really radical, and he suggests that the laws should be rewritten so that more Supreme Court justices would be on the Supreme Court. So basically, this was not even well disguised. This was an attempt because who appoints Supreme Court justices? That's right, the president does. And so he was thinking that he could overcome this conservative majority if he could just appoint more justices. Well, this was opposed on every level. Even the Democrats who had voted for him recognized that he was tampering with something big, with checks and balances. Our Constitution was written in a way that no one branch of government could overpower the others. And so FDR stepped way out of bounds, even in the eyes of people who voted for him, by suggesting that he could overpower the Supreme Court by adding more justices to it. It's kind of like John Adams and the Midnight Appointments. This was really bold on his part, and people who supported him even did not like this. So he eventually yields to public pressure, and withdraws this plan. The funny thing is that there were actually, during his presidency, there were a lot of justices who resigned or died. And so he wound up appointing several justices and gained the pro-New Deal majority that he was hoping for, even though he didn't change the law to do so. All right, so the New Deal begins to wind down. There are a couple of reasons why. Number one is the Supreme Court battle. Roosevelt took a hit to his personal reputation and his political reputation in the way that he was suggesting the laws be changed. And so the court battle helped bring the New Deal to an end. This is kind of like the beginning of the end. But also in 1937, there was a series of strikes that alarmed the public. And these were sit-down strikes, which started in Flint, Michigan, when workers from General Motors barricaded themselves inside the factory. And then when the police came to break up the strike, they defended themselves with all sorts of tools and soda bottles and spare parts. And so this kind of brought public attention to the fact that these strikes were happening. It also shows that if there are strikes, that people are doing well enough to be able to complain about wages. And so the economy was beginning to swing upward. So June of 1937, the same year, like I said, there was a moderate increase in the economy. And so FDR cuts government spending, thinking, hey, the economy is moving upward now, and we can stop some of these programs. But what happened was what became called the Roosevelt recession. And so there was a downturn in the stock market when he cut government spending. There was more unemployment and a decline in industrial output. And so he was like, you know what? Forget it. He committed himself fully to heavy deficit spending after that, starting in April of 1938 because of the Roosevelt recession. So Congress decides to pass an almost $4 billion public works bill, more agricultural programs, and the Fair Labor Standards Acts. But the thing is, they spent $4 billion on this series of new government programs, but they really didn't do very much to ease the Roosevelt recession, and he alienated the conservatives by doing this. And so, especially after the midterm elections of 1938, there was a coalition of conservative Democrats and Republicans who were able to gain enough power to stop New Deal programs. And so that's kind of confusing, but basically what you should remember here is that there was a slight upturn in the economy. Roosevelt stopped government spending. The stock market went down again, so he greatly increased government spending, and it didn't help the recession. And then in the midterm elections, his opponents gained enough power to stop New Deal programs. So anyway, the New Deal comes to an end. The significance of the New Deal. Number one, the New Deal did help alleviate the suffering of the Great Depression, but it did not revive the economy. Like we said, it wasn't until World War II started, when we began shifting factory production to make war goods, that we came out of the Great Depression. The greatest significance, I think, is that, FDR created the welfare state. Granted, this is different from welfare today. Roosevelt was not just handing out money, he was giving out government jobs, which paid people. But this greatly changed the role of government. And people began to look at the government not as an institution that should protect them and protect their private property, but they looked at the government to take care of them. And so people viewed the government differently after the New Deal, that it was the government's job to provide for them, not just protect them, but to provide for them. And that is significant. FDR obviously greatly expands executive powers in order to create these New Deal programs. And he, a lot of people criticize him because he did create the welfare state. But the thing was, he was willing to try different approaches, and he tried something. And it didn't solve the problem of the Great Depression, but it did help. In doing so, though, he did greatly expand the powers of president. All right, so we're going to look at women, blacks, and Indians during the New Deal. We'll talk about women today, and then we'll pick up with blacks and the New Deal tomorrow. But one of the things that happened during FDR's presidency and during the New Deal was that women began to gain more positions in the government. And the reason why is because of Eleanor Roosevelt and this other lady named Molly Dewson, who was the head of the women's division of the Democratic National Committee. But because they were very outspoken about women and women's rights and women being able to now vote, and women should be able to serve in government, and women should be reform minded, and they should be leading the way in terms of civil rights and things like that. Because they were so outspoken, they actually did lead to more women working in government, and they also fought for civil rights. This is one of the things that Eleanor Roosevelt was especially passionate about. So one of the things that happened was the Daughters of the Revolution, which are just that, they are daughters whose dads fought in the American Revolution, refused to let Marian Anderson, who was a black opera singer, use their Washington auditorium. Eleanor Roosevelt actually resigned her membership of the Daughters of the Revolution. So she stepped out of the organization altogether because they wouldn't let Marian Anderson sing in their auditorium because she was black. And the concert wound up being moved to the Lincoln Memorial, where Eleanor Roosevelt encouraged several politicians to support the event. And this was, seemingly a small thing, but in doing so, this was a huge move on behalf of civil rights. So, thanks to Eleanor Roosevelt, women made gains during this time, and so did the civil rights movement.